On the morning of August 9, 1945, Major Charles Sweeney piloted the B-29 Boxcar over Japan's skies, unaware that the fate of an entire nation would soon be sealed. His plane, carrying the second atomic bomb in history, was destined for Nagasaki, a port city located on Japan's southern island of Kyushu. Just 3 days earlier, the United States had dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a city of nearly 350,000 people. The bomb, named Little Boy, had leveled the city in an instant, killing an estimated 70,000 people instantly, with many more dying later from radiation poisoning and burns. The Japanese, initially in disbelief, were now trying to comprehend the scale of the destruction. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, a veteran naval officer and former Prime Minister of Japan, was grappling with the first bomb's impact. Yonai was known for his pragmatism and military expertise. He had been with the Imperial Japanese Navy for decades, participating in key naval victories and later crucial decisions during the war. His calm demeanor stood in contrast to the more radical members of Japan's leadership, who sought to continue fighting at all costs. As the news of Hiroshima's destruction began to trickle into Japan's Imperial General Headquarters, Yonai and his fellow leaders gathered in the Imperial Palace's underground bunker. They were faced with the grim reality that Japan's war effort had not only been stalled but now faced an existential threat. The first bomb had obliterated Hiroshima. The second, though still uncertain in its aftermath, was already a horrifying reality. As Yonai and his colleagues sat around a table, there was an eerie sense of disbelief. Even the hardliners who had long rejected the idea of surrender could not ignore the overwhelming destruction now visited upon Japan. Yonai, however, understood the broader implications of these bombings in a way that others did not. He had spent his life in the Imperial Navy, rising through its ranks during Japan's wars and expansions. He had always been a strategic thinker, focused on Japan's long-term survival. However, even he could not deny that Japan's military, after years of intense bombing raids, had been worn down to its core. The Navy's strength was no longer sufficient to stave off the inevitable. As the first bomb exploded over Hiroshima, it had provided an undeniable shift in the war's dynamics. The country had been left paralyzed, trying to comprehend a level of destruction never before seen. In Yonai's mind, the atomic bomb's power confirmed what he had been fearing for months. Japan's resistance was no longer sustainable. At this crucial moment, the second bomb was on its way. Unlike the first bombing on August 6th, which had been a direct strike on a civilian target, Nagasaki's fate had been sealed by a series of miscalculations. The original target was Kokura, but thick clouds and smoke from fires forced the American pilots to divert their course. At 11 o'clock and 1 minute in the morning, Sweeney dropped the second bomb, Fat Man, over the Urakami River Valley in Nagasaki. The blast generated a fireball of 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, instantly vaporizing much of the city and creating a shockwave that shattered windows miles away. Back in Tokyo, the news came in slowly. The government had no immediate communication with Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped, which left many in the Imperial General Headquarters wondering what had happened. Initially, there was confusion. No one had expected the United States to possess a weapon of such destruction. But soon, the reports started to trickle in, and by 1:30 in the afternoon, the truth began to unfold. Nagasaki had been destroyed just as Hiroshima had been. The scale of the devastation was incomprehensible. Yonai, despite his years of experience and countless battles at sea, had never encountered a force of destruction like this. The reports indicated that nearly 40,000 people had died instantly, with more succumbing to the effects of radiation in the following days. But it wasn't just the immediate impact that shook Yonai. It was the realization that Japan had no way of defending itself against such a weapon. The United States, it seemed, had a weapon that could obliterate Japan's cities in seconds. Sitting in the war room, Yonai knew that Japan had no time left. The hardliners in the room argued vehemently against surrender. They spoke of honor, of fighting until the last man, of defending the emperor's divine rule. But Yonai, ever the pragmatist, understood the truth. Japan had lost the war. The nuclear bomb had proved that to him in a way that words could not express. The use of this new weapon marked the end of the war. The sheer scale of the destruction that had already occurred was a testament to that fact. As the day wore on, Yonai sat quietly, reflecting on his long years of service. He had witnessed Japan's rise as a military power, from its victories in the Russo-Japanese War to the early successes of World War II. He had watched as the empire expanded, its ambitions reaching into China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. But now everything seemed to be unraveling. The world had changed in an instant, and Japan, as a military power, was no longer capable of resisting the forces that had been unleashed against it. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as the reports from Nagasaki continued to flood in, Yonai's thoughts turned to the next steps. The military leaders in Tokyo were still divided. Some, like General Anami and General Umezu, argued for continued resistance. But Yonai knew that the time had come for a different approach. Japan had already suffered countless casualties, and the atomic bomb had proven that the empire was no match for the might of the United States. It was time to consider surrender. Yonai knew that Japan's only chance at survival now lay in accepting the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied demand for Japan's unconditional surrender. But this was a delicate matter. The Emperor's voice was the final word in Japan, and Yonai understood that the Emperor's intervention was necessary to sway the hardliners and bring an end to the conflict. The bomb had created the perfect excuse for the Emperor to step in, but for that to happen, Yonai needed to act swiftly. As the day drew to a close, Yonai made a decision that would change the course of Japan's future. He would advocate for surrender, but he would do so in a way that maintained Japan's honor. His words, though measured and pragmatic, would have profound consequences. Yonai, once a staunch defender of Japan's military ambitions, now understood that the only way forward was to accept the reality of Japan's defeat. The bombs, in his mind, had been a divine intervention, a necessary evil to force Japan into peace. By August 10th, Yonai had convinced the cabinet to send a peace message to Emperor Hirohito. The message was clear: Japan's survival depended on accepting the Potsdam Declaration. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had destroyed the myth of Japan's invincibility. Yonai's words would guide Japan through the final days of the war and into the post-war era. The surrender process had begun. In the days that followed, the Japanese government scrambled to communicate with the Allies and prepare for the inevitable. The Emperor, once hesitant, finally spoke out, broadcasting Japan's acceptance of the surrender terms on August 15, 1945. The war was over. Yonai, though he had played a key role in Japan's capitulation, would not live to see the full extent of the new world that would emerge. He died in 1948, but his legacy as a man who guided Japan toward peace rather than prolonging the war would remain. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not only shattered Japan's military, but had also marked the end of an era. Yonai's acceptance of the new reality had saved countless lives, both Japanese and American, and allowed Japan to rebuild itself in the aftermath of the devastation. In the end, the bomb had been both the weapon of destruction and the catalyst for peace, forever changing the course of history. On August 10, 1945, the weight of the situation bore down on Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. The news of the second atomic bombing, only days after the devastation of Hiroshima, confirmed what Yonai had feared for months. Japan's survival in the war was no longer possible. He knew that the bombs dropped on the Japanese cities were not simply another raid, nor was this just a continuation of the same type of destruction they had endured through conventional bombing campaigns. These were weapons of such terrifying power that they had obliterated entire cities, leaving nothing but ruins and death in their wake. Nagasaki had been hit, and like Hiroshima, it was a city transformed into a lifeless wasteland. Yonai had long been an advocate for a more cautious approach to warfare, questioning the wisdom of Japan's aggressive militaristic expansion. He had seen the consequences of Japan's push for dominance firsthand, and now with the destruction of two major cities, it was impossible to ignore the signs that Japan's military power had been decimated beyond repair. The United States had demonstrated unequivocally that they could destroy Japan at will, without the need for a prolonged invasion. The use of nuclear bombs had forced Japan into a corner from which there was no escape. In the midst of the chaos, the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo convened a meeting of high-ranking officials to discuss Japan's future. The mood in the room was tense. The hardliners, led by figures like War Minister Anami and General Umezu, still clung to the hope that Japan could somehow win this war. They spoke of honor, of continuing to fight, of the glory that awaited those who sacrificed everything for the emperor and the nation. Their words were impassioned, their voices full of conviction. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. The Japanese forces had been crippled by years of war, and now, with the advent of nuclear weaponry, Japan was helpless. These men, loyal to their country and their emperor, could not fathom surrender. But Yonai knew what had to be done. The time for battle had passed. There was no path to victory, only the potential for total destruction remained. In the underground bunker of the Imperial Palace, Yonai sat quietly among the gathered leaders, contemplating his options. The war had gone on for so long. Japan had already suffered immeasurable losses, lives lost, cities reduced to rubble, and families torn apart. The Imperial Navy, once a proud and powerful force, had been decimated. The Imperial Army, too, had suffered catastrophic losses. With the Japanese people already on the brink of starvation, Yonai understood the gravity of the situation. The war had to end. By now, the realities of the atomic bombings were evident. With the combined destructive power of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan was left with no capacity for meaningful resistance. Yonai had watched as Japan's defense strategy crumbled, as cities were bombed into oblivion, and as civilians were forced to endure the unimaginable toll of total war. In his mind, there was only one option left. Japan had to surrender. But even as he reached this conclusion, he knew that such a move would be met with fierce opposition from the hardliners in the government. This was not a surrender in the conventional sense, but rather a shift in tactics, a strategic retreat designed to preserve the Japanese people and the nation's future. As the meeting in the bunker progressed, Yonai remained calm, even as his fellow officers debated the future of the nation. Tensions were rising. The hardliners were pushing for a continuation of the fight, believing that Japan's honor and military spirit could somehow overcome the overwhelming odds stacked against them. But Yonai could see that the emperor's intervention was the only way forward. The emperor, as the divine figurehead of Japan, held the ultimate power in shaping the country's fate. If he were to give his blessing for surrender, the rest of the country would follow. It was a delicate and fraught task, one that required Yonai to walk a fine line between pragmatism and national pride. At around 3:45 in the afternoon, Yonai had the opportunity to speak with Togo and Suzuki's secretary during a brief recess. He expressed his thoughts in hushed tones, his voice steady but filled with resolve. It may be inappropriate to put it this way, but the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, God's gifts to the Japanese regime, because they have provided the rationale for the emperor to intervene and end the war. These words, though carefully chosen, were a profound shift in Yonai's thinking. He had long believed in Japan's ability to resist, but now, faced with the undeniable destruction wrought by the atomic bombs, he saw them as a divine intervention, an opportunity for Japan to preserve itself, its people, and its honor by making peace. Yonai's words were not just pragmatic, they were a reflection of his deeply held belief in the importance of Japan's survival. He had spent his career in the Navy, defending the empire, but now he understood that the continued resistance would only lead to further devastation. The emperor's intervention, in Yonai's eyes, was necessary to bring about peace, to end the senseless bloodshed. He knew that surrender was the only way to stop Japan from being completely destroyed. Togo, who had been taking notes throughout the conversation, questioned Yonai's approach, fearing that the army would view it as an act of treason. Yonai's response was clear and unflinching. Let the emperor speak. His voice is divine mandate. The bombs illuminate our path to peace, sparing the sacred soil from further desecration. Yonai knew that his words would resonate with the emperor's divine authority, and that ultimately it was the emperor's decision that would guide Japan to peace. At 4:05 in the afternoon, the meeting resumed, and Yonai deferred to Hirohito's liaison, Prince Konoe. to relay the message about the gifts of the atomic bombs and the Soviet Union's entry into the war. This subtle but powerful message had the desired effect. Suzuki, the Prime Minister, agreed to seek an audience with the Emperor, marking the beginning of the surrender process. In the following days, Yonai's words would play a pivotal role in Japan's surrender. The Emperor, who had been reluctant to intervene, finally acknowledged the harsh reality of the situation. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made his historic radio address to the nation, announcing Japan's acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. Yonai's role in Japan's surrender was a turning point in his long career. Once a staunch military leader, he had come to see that the preservation of Japan's future was more important than the defense of its military honor. His pragmatism and willingness to put the country's survival above all else marked him as a key figure in Japan's peaceful transition from war to peace. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though devastating, had ultimately forced Japan to confront the reality of its situation and take the necessary steps to end the conflict. Yonai's legacy would endure as a man who helped guide Japan through its darkest hour, recognizing the inevitability of surrender and the hope for a better future. The reverberations of Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai's God's Gifts observation extended far beyond the Imperial Palace's bunker on August 9, 1945. Yonai's pragmatic words resonated deeply, shaping the mechanics of Japan's surrender, the post-war occupation, and decades of atomic historiography. Within 48 hours of the Nagasaki bombing, as the death toll continued to rise and Soviet tanks overran Harbin, Yonai's thoughts would guide the final acts of Japan's wartime governance. The toll of Nagasaki was horrendous. By the afternoon of August 10th, the death toll had climbed to 74,000, with more succumbing to radiation sickness in the days that followed. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were swiftly advancing, overrunning Japan's territories in Manchuria, and Japan's war leaders faced two stark realizations. The country could not withstand the full might of both the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry into the war. Yonai, in this pivotal moment, framed the bombings as an opportunity for Japan to preserve itself, its future, and ultimately its honor, by moving toward peace. At the heart of Japan's decision was Emperor Hirohito, the divine figurehead whose authority was absolute. Yonai knew that in order to prompt Japan's capitulation, the emperor's voice would be necessary to sway the nation's military hardliners. Yonai's quiet but powerful shift in perspective, seeing the bombs as God's gifts, had already laid the foundation for this monumental change in Japan's military strategy. The emperor had always remained hesitant about intervening in such crucial matters, but Yonai understood that the destruction wrought by the bombs had left the country with no viable options. On August 10th, at around 4:05 in the afternoon, Yonai met with Prince Konoe, Hirohito's trusted liaison. It was a meeting that would prove crucial. He conveyed to Konoe the significance of the atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war, emphasizing that these two forces combined had changed the world order and Japan's position in it. He urged the necessity of the emperor's intervention, asserting that the nation's future rested in the emperor's hands. By evening, Prime Minister Suzuki had agreed to seek an audience with the emperor, marking the early stages of Japan's surrender process. Meanwhile, Yonai's words continued to reverberate through the corridors of power. The emperor's voice was the final word, and his intervention would signal the end of the war. Yonai's pragmatic appeal to the emperor allowed the entire government to recalibrate, and the nation began to turn toward peace in a way that had not been previously possible. The hardliners in the government who had clung to the idea of continued resistance found themselves out of step with the stark realities unfolding around them. The most significant moment arrived on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito, after much deliberation, made his historic radio address to the nation. His voice, calm and deliberate, conveyed the heart-wrenching message: "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." In this moment, Hirohito's voice of divine authority gave legitimacy to the act of surrender, and the nation collectively shifted from war to peace. The acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration marked the official end of the conflict. However, the aftermath of this moment was not without further complexities. The hardliners in Japan, who still clung to honor and the notion of total resistance, found themselves increasingly marginalized. Yonai's support of surrender, backed by the emperor's words, enabled Japan's leadership to regain a sense of direction and focus. This shift allowed Japan to move from wartime devastation toward the long process of rebuilding. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, Yonai was instrumental in facilitating the transition. As a senior naval officer and statesman, Yonai took a critical role in the demobilization of Japan's forces. His leadership helped mitigate the shock of surrender within the ranks, and his influence ensured that the country could avoid the mass suicides that had characterized previous Japanese defeats. As a de facto naval coordinator, he issued orders to the Imperial Navy to stand down, resulting in the destruction of 120 vessels under Operation Z, a move intended to prevent the salvage of Japanese warships while also protecting the lives of those remaining in Japan's naval ranks. In the coming months, Yonai's pragmatism and leadership continued to guide the nation. He played a key role in organizing the repatriation of 6.5 million troops and 1.2 million civilians from the country's former occupied territories. His orchestration of the Operation Blacklist shipping system was vital in the process of repatriation, as it enabled the safe return of Japanese forces from the Southeast Asian theater. During the U.S. occupation of Japan, which began in 1945 and ended in 1952, Yonai served as an advisor to the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. He worked closely with American officials to demobilize the Japanese military and help establish a new post-war structure for Japan. His influence as a military leader proved to be invaluable in the nation's transformation from an imperial power to a pacifist nation, as he advocated for the renunciation of war and the establishment of peaceful diplomatic ties. In addition to his post-war role, Yonai's legacy continued to evolve. While his efforts to guide Japan to peace were initially met with some resistance, history has largely viewed him as a key figure in Japan's transition from total war to a peaceful future. His acknowledgement of the inevitability of surrender, his courage to act in the nation's best interest, and his ability to persuade the emperor to intervene ultimately saved countless lives. The global legacy of Yonai's words and the subsequent actions of the emperor shaped the trajectory of post-war diplomacy. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, marked the formal end of World War II and reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The atomic bombings, though horrific in their destruction, proved to be the decisive factor in bringing the war to an end, forcing Japan's leaders to confront the reality of their situation and ultimately seek peace. Yonai's personal legacy continued beyond his death in 1948. His role in Japan's surrender and subsequent rebuilding was seen as a vital contribution to the post-war order. His words during the fateful August 10th meeting with his fellow officials reflected his deep commitment to Japan's survival and his understanding that the nation could not continue fighting without risking its complete annihilation. Yonai's pragmatism and his unflinching commitment to peace left an indelible mark on the post-war reconstruction of Japan. In the decades following World War II, Yonai's influence continued to be felt. His pragmatic approach to Japan's wartime strategy helped pave the way for a more peaceful, cooperative post-war Japan. The decisions he made and the words he spoke ultimately helped Japan recover from the devastation of the war and re-establish itself as a peaceful, prosperous nation in the global community. Through Yonai's actions and decisions, Japan was able to navigate the challenging transition from wartime devastation to post-war reconstruction. His legacy stands as a testament to the power of pragmatism, diplomacy, and leadership in times of crisis. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while horrific, forced Japan to re-evaluate its path and accept the painful realities of its situation. Yonai's legacy remains a key part of Japan's journey toward peace, a journey that continues to shape the country to this day.